Hey guys, hope you enjoyed the long Easter weekend. We're going to spend a couple of days just talking about The Outsiders, no vocab for a few days, which I'm sure you'll be thankful for. But we will get back to that on Thursday for one class, Friday for the other. So be ready for that. We'll get into Unit 12 when we do that. But for now, let's talk about Chapter 8 of The Outsiders. So again, we're still in a little bit of a lull in the action. Hinton has done a good job of kind of letting things die down and slack off so that she can build tension back up. Again, we talked about how when you have a plot pyramid, we do this with the actual pyramid that we draw, but in reality, a lot of times it's kind of this thing where it's a series of mini climaxes and then drop offs and lulls and things like that. So we had a bit of a climax there at the church, and now we're kind of in this valley. It's slacked off. We're getting more information about the characters. We're getting a lot of plot development, a lot of information. But we're not getting a lot of action necessarily. A lot of conversation, a lot of walking around, a lot of sitting around, but not as much doing. So it's I don't think it's boring, but it's not quite as gripping as some of the earlier parts of the book had been. I promise it's going to pick back up if you're kind of cooling on it at this point. It does pick back up to that action that it had earlier on. I think the latter part of the book I think is actually better than the beginning. So bear with it. But in chapter 8, the start of it is Two Bit and Ponyboy trying to visit Johnny in the hospital. At first, they won't let them in. The doctor says it can't hurt. It says Pony notices the doctor's tone when he says this. Two Bit doesn't seem to. Pony realizes Johnny's probably dying, which we can realize based on the condition he's in and the way he's acting. He seems to know it. Ponyboy doesn't admit it to Johnny, and Two Bit doesn't seem to recognize it. But even he, when they go visit Dally later, says he doesn't look good. So Johnny's in really bad shape, and he wants a copy of Gone with the Wind so that Pony can read to him again. So Two Bit goes to get that, and Pony sits there and he tries to reassure Johnny, and he talks about how brave he looks. He says, the Southern gentlemen don't have anything on him, which after the incident at the church, I tend to agree. Johnny seems like a pretty brave kid here now towards what looks like it's going to be the end of his life. And Johnny's pretty self-aware about this. He says at the bottom of page 121 in my version, "You want to know something, Ponyboy? I'm scared stiff. I used to talk about killing myself." He drew a quivering breath. "I don't want to die now. It ain't long enough. 16 years ain't long enough. I wouldn't mind it so much if there wasn't so much stuff I ain't done yet and so many things I ain't seen. It's not fair. You know what? That time we were in Windricksville was the only time I've been away from our neighborhood." So Johnny's recognizing that there's a good chance he's coming towards the end of his life here. And he says, based on my awful home life and the fact that I didn't really have any hope, I was a greaser and all that, there were times when he considered suicide, which is something that I hope you guys never have to deal with. But this was, this is a kid coming from a home life that's probably different from most of yours, I hope. Where his parents didn't care for him, they beat him. We see the coldness of his mother, and apparently she's not as bad as his dad is. And he says, this is the only time I'd even been away from our neighborhood, was when we had to run away because I'd murdered someone. And now that he's murdered someone and rescued these kids from a burning church, shown some initiative of his own, and we talked about that in that discussion question. You guys gave some pretty good answers. Now that he's kind of taken the reins of his own life, he says, it's not enough. I want more. I want to be able to experience these things. I want to have a life at this point. So it's a kind of a sad situation now that he's made this decision, now that he started taking these chances and doing these things for himself. At best, he's going to end up in a wheelchair for the rest of his life, most likely. So it's a sad situation. Johnny's story is one that's pretty difficult to read without feeling a little bit emotional about it. And he's a character that a lot of people get attached to, that a lot of people come away from this book remembering. Usually people, they remember Ponyboy, but Johnny's the one that people will hold on to for years down the road besides Ponyboy. And there's good reason for that. He serves as kind of a counterexample for Ponyboy. Ponyboy, he thinks of all these things that are wrong with his life, when really he's got a great life. Two Bit says, Derry's more strict with you than your parents were, isn't he? And Ponyboy says, yeah. He says, but my parents, Ponyboy, again, having realized some things about Derry at this point, says, my parents had already raised two sons. I was the third. So they kind of knew to slack off a little bit, but Derry hasn't. I'm the first kid he's ever had to really take care of. So this is Derry being a parent for the first time. Of course, he's going to be strict, which I think is a smart thing for Ponyboy to say. But again, he compares his own life, or he complains about his own life quite a bit and the things that he goes through. Like he's got it tough, and he does in some ways. He does. He's lost both of his parents, but compared to Johnny, there's always someone who has it worse, which I think is a point in this book that it tries to make. It tries to get us to realize that no matter how bad things may seem for you, there's always someone out there who's suffering more. Um, and even then, like in Johnny's case, he says, I decided I really wish I had longer. I wish that this hadn't happened. It's not fair, right? When I, decide what I want to do with life, right? When I see that there are things out there for me, this happens and I'm going to be either dead or crippled, which is, it's a pretty dark outlook, but this book does have some dark moments. So they go to visit Dally, and for the first time, Ponyboy feels a little bit of camaraderie with him. He's starting to see, that deeper side of Dally as well. This is part of Ponyboy's development throughout the book. He starts to see sides of people that he didn't early on. Like I said, he's very observant, but he's got blind spots for certain people, mainly Derry and Dally and himself. But as the book moves on, he starts to kind of figure out those people. And here with Dally, he starts to see a little bit of maybe why Johnny and Cherry are kind of enamored with him. And he says, we had that little bit of companionship there for just a moment, just because he was glad he didn't kill me, which is kind of amusing. But it also shows Ponyboy's mindset and how easily his mind can change at this point, at this age, which is pretty true. Most of you guys, y'all aren't even 14 yet, and your minds change just like that. Your opinions on people can flip one day from one day to the next. And I'm not saying adults can't, because we absolutely can, but you guys are particularly susceptible to that at this age. And that's something that Ponyboy does. He flip-flops on people quite a bit. One minute he's hating Derry's guts and he thinks Derry's the worst thing that's happened to him. The next minute, he loves Derry to death and he's making excuses for why he's so strict. One minute he thinks Dally's the worst person on the planet. The next minute he's friends with him because Dally says, "I'm glad I didn't accidentally kill you." So it's a pretty funny thing how quickly he flip-flops. And again, this is a blind spot he has about himself. He doesn't realize what he's doing there. But it tells us a little bit about him as a character, that no matter how smart he or anyone may seem, they can still change their mind about things. They can still be kind of inconsistent and unpredictable. So after they leave the hospital, they're talking about well, not after they leave, as they're leaving, they're talking a little bit about the Rumble and how they're going to fight. And we get a little bit of foreshadowing again when Dally asks 2-Bit for his fancy switchblade. We don't know why, but some of you may have some guesses, and I'll leave that up to the actual book to reveal to you. I won't spoil that, but he asks for the switchblade, and of course 2-Bit gives it to him because it says if he didn't have a really good reason, he wouldn't have asked. But the more important part of this chapter that I really want to get to, outside of the bit with Johnny, because that is very important, as we get towards the end of the book, or not the end of the book, the end of the chapter, Ponyboy goes with 2-Bit back to their neighborhood, and they see Cherry Valance sitting in her Corvette, her red Stingray Corvette, which if you've never seen a 60s model Stingray Corvette, go look one up. They're pretty nice cars. I'd love to have one if anybody ever gets really rich and wants to give me a gift. So they, and Ponyboy, on this walk, he tells 2-Bit, I don't feel really good about this Rumble. And 2-Bit's kind of picking at him, saying like, "Oh, you're just scared," and all that. And he knows that's not true. Ponyboy says he can tell that 2-Bit knows this isn't true. But 2-Bit pretends not to understand. He pretends that he's just going to make a joke out of it. It says, basically 2-Bit's got the potential, the ability, like we talked about how he's probably smarter than he lets on, to realize that there's something wrong here. There's something not right about all this fighting. Especially after Johnny's probably going to die, Bob's been killed. There's something off about going and fighting. Same reason Randy cut and left and decided he wasn't going to be part of it. And Ponyboy's trying to talk about this with 2-Bit, and 2-Bit's he's purposefully ignorant of it. He says I basically shuts his mind off to it and won't let it become a real thought to it. And this is, I talked about round and flat characters, and I think almost every character in this book is round to some extent. Maybe some characters who briefly show up, like Steve and Marcia, are maybe a little bit more flat. But most characters that get more than a couple pages of screen time, so to speak, are pretty round. They're pretty detailed, developed, deep characters, which, I think Hinton does a great job of. But static and dynamic is the thing I want to talk about as far as characterization. And if you don't remember what that means, a static character is a character that doesn't change. It doesn't mean they're not deep. It doesn't mean that they don't have a lot going on. It just means that from the first page of the novel where you encounter them to the last page you encounter them, They don't develop or change a lot. Basically, they're the same person beginning to end. A dynamic character changes heavily from beginning to end. Most of the time, your book's protagonist, like Ponyboy, is going to be very dynamic, especially in a Bildungsroman like this, a coming of age novel, because if they don't change, there's no coming of age. Now, there are some modern novels where the purpose is for the main character not to change, to show kind of like an anti Bildungsroman, a character that doesn't grow and change with their situation, but those are usually a little bit more modern, and they usually serve to prove kind of the opposite point. So don't worry about that. Most of the time for you guys, protagonist is going to be dynamic. Ponyboy certainly is. We've already seen him change a lot in the way he thinks about things and approaches things in this novel. A lot of the other characters are pretty dynamic. I think Johnny is absolutely very dynamic. I think to some extent Dally is. Then there are characters like Two Bit that, though I think he's round, I think he's got depth. I think there's more to him than just a comic relief, which he easily could have been. He's got a lot more going on than that, but he doesn't really change much because he won't let himself, and that's something that's pointed out to us here. It's on page 127 for me. In that conversation with Ponyboy right before they meet Cherry, he basically shuts himself off to that potential for change, for character development. Because it's uncomfortable for him, and a lot of people are like this. A lot of people don't change even though they could, and even though deep down they know they should, because it's uncomfortable. So again, I think this is a pretty incredible observation for a 16-year-old writer to have made. But anyway, they go along and they're talking to Cherry Valance. She tells Two Bit and Pony some information. Basically, the Socias are going to fight fair. They're going to fight by the rules. Two Bit thanks her for the information, goes on. She wants Pony to stop and talk to her, so he does. She asks him about, she tells him that Randy's not showing up. Ponyboy says, yeah, I know. And she explains it to him. She says, he's not scared. He's just sick of fighting. Tells him the same things Randy did, about Bob, about how he was different. All these great things about Bob we keep hearing that we didn't get to see. Apparently there's a completely different side of this kid. Apparently he was a pretty round character as well, who just made some dumb decisions and did some stupid things, got himself killed. And says that they'd been friends since grade school. And Ponyboy again makes a really sharp observation. He says, this is kind of like Soda and Steve. They've been friends since they were kids, and they're extremely close. They're like this. He says, if one of them died, would the other stop fighting? He said, Steve wouldn't, I don't think. He said, Steve, and he said, Bob probably wouldn't have, now that I think about it. He said, maybe if Randy had been killed, Bob would still be there tonight fighting. But he says Soda probably would. Soda would probably stop, and Randy stopped. So he's again pointing out to us that it's not about the class, it's not about Soch or Greaser, it's about the person. Because as we've seen, some of the people in this book could fit into either social class. Two Bit straight up says, if not for us, Derry would be a Soch, because he's a great athlete, he's a hard worker, he's more of a clean-cut, upstanding guy. He's 6'2", he's muscular, apparently just a really straight-up good guy, like a guy that you would take home to your parents and say, hey, this is my best friend, and they'd be like, oh, great, he's a good influence. That kind of person, the kind of person you would look up to at your age. And he fits in with that Soch mindset, like the kids with the nice cars who live in nice houses, have nice families. And even with the others, even with his brothers in the gang, if his parents were still alive, he still might be part of the Soches. He might have gone to college. He might have played football in college. But also, we're not told this specifically, but what about Ponyboy? He says, Derry's too smart to be a greaser, really, but Ponyboy's the one who makes great grades. Ponyboy's the one who's supposed to be just extremely intelligent and creative. Ponyboy's the one who reads books and memorizes poetry line for line, and all this different thing. The one that watches sunsets and is really sensitive and all that. He doesn't really fit in with the greasers either. But this is still a blind spot for him. He doesn't realize this about himself. So another huge point of this book with its man versus society conflict is that all these stereotypes, yes, sometimes they're true, sometimes they are, or else they wouldn't exist. So the Bob is probably kind of the stereotypical Soch. Even if there's more to him than just that, he fits that mold. The rich kid who does whatever they want and doesn't think about the consequences. That's Bob. Steve and Dally probably fit that stereotypical greaser mode. They're kind of gangster types. They enjoy robbing stores and picking fights with people, and they're not necessarily great people that you'd want to hang out with on a regular basis. There's still more to them than that, but they do fit the stereotype. On the other hand, most of the people in these social classes don't. Most of the Soches we've met, Randy and Cherry, they don't fit that. Most of the greasers we've met, Soda, Derry, Ponyboy, even 2-Bit, they don't necessarily fully fit that mold Johnny. They don't necessarily fit in 100% with what we've been told about greasers or socias. So that's another thing that Hinton is very careful about showing us. Now, in Pony's conversation with Cherry, he gets kind of upset with her. You know, the whole thing. He's thinking it's Bob's fault. Why won't she go visit Johnny? Why won't she go see him? Then he kind of has the realization, well, Johnny did kill her boyfriend. So, and she talks to him about that. She says, you know, I understand that it was probably Bob's fault. He did it to himself. It was going to happen one way or the other. But I can't go see the person who killed him. I just can't. And I think that's reasonable. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Again, she knew a side of Bob that we don't. And Pony realizes again as he's talking to her, like, hey, these things about Bob are why she's so scared of being around Dally and falling for him, because apparently he thinks Dally is kind of the greaser version of Bob, which I tend to agree. There's a certain realness to him, a certain bravery that he has, a certain charm that he does have that a lot of people around him kind of fall for. And Bob apparently had the same thing. People want to follow him. People want to do things for him. People want to be around him, even though he's not necessarily a good person. This, again, what I'm saying goes for both Bob and Dally. And they both have those self-destructive tendencies where if someone doesn't tell them no, it's probably going to end up getting them killed. And it has for Bob. So that's another interesting observation that Ponyboy makes. Again, he's getting pretty good with these. And he gets mad at Cherry and lashes out at her. He does have a tendency to do this. He did it early in the book to Johnny when he talks about how his parents didn't want him, and 2-Bit smacks him for it, which he deserved. Nobody's here to smack him when he's mean to Cherry, although he probably deserves it here as well. Where he tells her, you're a traitor and all this, and you're not helping us, and basically just kind of drags her through the mud. Says, you're sitting there in your fancy Corvette and all this, like, why are you even bothering? And he says, he can tell it almost made her cry. And she says, I'm trying to help you guys out. Basically, she doesn't agree with all the violence, and she wants it to stop. And Ponyboy rises up for a minute and he asks her again about the sunset, again showing that from different sides of life you still see the same sunset, that same thing. There's still something in common, which is again an important theme of this book. But keep that in mind as we read and go forward. Those things about social class and individuals and all that. And the thing with Johnny's mother, I forgot to mention, but obviously that probably stood out to most of you, how cold she is and how insistent she is on seeing Johnny. And it gives us a glimpse of the home life that a lot of these greasers probably deal with and how they probably end up the way they are. Versus having, nice rich parents with nice jobs like a lot of the socias probably have. So discussion question for today. I want you to think about static versus dynamic. So a character that changes, a character that doesn't change, static, stays in one place. Dynamic, changes, grows, develops. And don't pick Ponyboy because he's very obviously dynamic, but pick any of the other characters in the novel. Tell me if you think they are static or dynamic and why. Okay, that's going to be a 4 to 5 sentence question. I'll have it posted shortly. But pick a character, static, dynamic, why. Okay, see you guys.